My sister walked into my wedding venue in a full-length white bridal gown, and I watched every single head in that room turn away from me. Not toward me, away from me, toward her. And in that moment, standing at the top of the aisle in my own dress, holding my father's arm, I understood something I had been refusing to understand for 31 years. But to explain what happened that day and why I did what I did, I need to go back. Way back. Because what my sister did at my wedding wasn't some impulsive, jealous act. It was the final move in a game she'd been playing since we were children, and I had been letting her win the whole time. My name is Claire Whitfield. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a 4-bedroom house that always smelled faintly of my mother's lavender candles and the particular brand of tension that lives in families where one child is loved and the other is tolerated. I was the tolerated one. My sister Danielle, Danny, everyone called her, was the loved one. I knew this by the time I was 7 years old. You don't need someone to sit you down and explain it. You just know. You know it in the way a mother's face changes when one daughter walks into a room versus the other. You know it in the Christmas morning photo where everyone is smiling except for you. And somehow, you're the one cut half out of the frame anyway. You know it, the way you know when it's about to rain. Your body figures it out before your brain does. My mother is Pamela Whitfield. She grew up in a small town in Kentucky, had dreams of being a competitive figure skater that never went anywhere. Married my father Richard at 22, and spent the rest of her life slowly, quietly, resenting the fact that her life had not turned out the way she planned. She wasn't a monster. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't abusive in any dramatic, obvious way. She never hit us. She never screamed. She was just cold, specifically cold toward me, warm toward Danny. And the difference between the warmth she gave my sister and the temperature she maintained around me was something I learned to live inside, the way you learn to live inside a house with bad insulation. You just put on an extra sweater and pretend it's fine. My father Richard was a good man. I believe that. He worked in insurance sales for 30 years, coached my little league softball team when I was 9, and loved my mother in that steady, uncomplicated way some men love their wives, completely and without much examination. He saw the favoritism. I know he did, because there were moments over the years when he would squeeze my shoulder, or leave an extra 20 in my jacket pocket, or show up at my school play when my mother didn't. Small compensations. He couldn't fix it, or didn't know how to fix it, or was too afraid of my mother to try. But he saw it, and sometimes that seeing was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Dani was 2 years younger than me. She had my mother's dark hair and her figure skating posture, always perfectly straight, always composed, always presenting herself to the world like someone who expected to be looked at. She was beautiful in that particular way that made people pay attention to her before she said a word, and she had learned very young how to use that attention. She wasn't just the golden child at home. She was the golden child everywhere she went, at school, at church, at birthday parties. Teachers adored her. Neighbors brought her extra cookies. She had a gift for making people feel like they were important to her, while simultaneously positioning herself at the exact center of every room she entered. I was the opposite. I was the kind of girl who sat at the edge of the room and watched. I was quieter, bookish, better with numbers than with people. I ran cross-country in high school, got decent grades, kept to myself mostly. I had a few close friends. I was not unhappy exactly. I just existed in a slightly dimmer version of whatever light Danny moved through. And I had made peace with that, or I thought I had. The pattern between us was so old, it had stopped feeling like a pattern and just started feeling like the weather. Danny borrowed things without asking and never gave them back. Danny interrupted conversations about me to make them about her. Danny was the one my mother called first when something happened. The one who got the longer hugs. The one whose drawings went on the refrigerator. Every birthday, every holiday, every family event, the light in my mother's eyes moved toward Danny and stayed there. And I learned to be okay being in the periphery. I had no choice but to learn to be okay with it. But there is a difference between surviving something and being healed from it. And I didn't understand that difference until Daniel. I met Daniel Marsh at a work conference in Cincinnati when I was 26. He was a project manager for a construction firm, tall, with dark curly hair, and this very specific laugh that sounded slightly surprised every time it happened, like laughter kept catching him off guard. We talked for 3 hours at the hotel bar after the conference panels ended, and by the end of the night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I was the most interesting person in the room. Not because he was flattering me, because he was actually listening. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things I mentioned 20 minutes earlier. He looked at me the way people are supposed to look at the person they're talking to. And I realized, sitting there in that hotel bar, that I had spent most of my life being talked past. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He proposed at the park where we'd had our first real date outside of that conference. A small park near the river in Cincinnati, with a bench we'd claimed as ours. He got down on one knee at that bench, and I cried before he'd even gotten the question out. The ring was simple, a thin gold band with a single oval diamond, exactly what I would have chosen myself, which he knew, because he'd asked my best friend Marcy what I liked before he went shopping. Marcy. I need to talk about Marcy, because she becomes important later. Marcy Oglesby and I had been friends since the 7th grade. She was the one person in my life who had always seen Danny clearly, not through my mother's gilded lens, not through the social goodwill Danny had accumulated everywhere she went, but clearly. Marcy had watched our dynamic for years, and she had opinions about it that she mostly kept to herself because she was a good enough friend to know when I wasn't ready to hear them. But she kept them. She filed them away. And when I finally needed them, they were right there. So Daniel proposed, and I said yes, and we started planning a wedding. That was when things with Danny got complicated in a new way. Because Danny had always been the one in the family who was supposed to get married first. She was the beautiful one, the charming one, the one men fell over themselves for. She'd had a serious boyfriend named Trevor for 2 years, and everyone in the family assumed that was heading somewhere. It wasn't. Trevor had broken up with her 8 months earlier, over something none of us got the full story on. And Danny had been quietly furious about it ever since. In the particular way she got furious. Not loud, not obvious, just a low-level, toxic hum beneath everything she said and did. When Daniel and I announced our engagement at a family dinner in November, I watched my mother hug me, a real hug, longer than her usual. And I thought for a moment that things might be different, that this might be the thing that finally shifted something. My mother pulled back and looked at me and said, "You look happy," which was the nicest thing she'd said to me in recent memory. And then Danny, sitting across the table, said, "Congratulations, Claire. I knew you'd find someone eventually." And everyone laughed because it sounded like a compliment if you weren't listening carefully. And I smiled and let it go, because that was what I always did. The wedding planning started in January. We set a date for the following October. The following October, 10 months away. And I threw myself into it with the kind of focused energy I usually reserved for work projects. I am, professionally, an accountant at a mid-size firm, and I bring the same methodical precision to everything I care about. I had a binder, I had a spreadsheet, I had vendor comparisons and timeline charts, and a seating arrangement that I revised 7 times. Daniel thought it was both impressive and slightly alarming. Marcy thought it was absolutely hilarious. I thought it was the most fun I'd had on any project in years. I asked Danny to be my maid of honor. This is the decision I have examined most in the months since, trying to understand what I was thinking. The honest answer is that I was thinking about my mother. I was thinking that if I gave Danny the role of maid of honor, my mother would feel included, would feel like both her daughters were part of this event, would feel good about it. I was making a decision about my own wedding based on managing my mother's feelings, which, in retrospect, tells you everything you need to know about the psychological state I was in. Danny accepted with exactly the right level of enthusiasm. She said she was so honored, so touched, so glad I asked her. She teared up a little. My mother looked at us both like this was the most wonderful thing she'd ever seen. And for a few weeks, we actually had something that resembled sisterly closeness. Danny came with me to my first dress appointment. She sat in the little velvet chair at the bridal boutique and sipped champagne and gave opinions and was, genuinely, I thought, present and helpful. When I put on the dress I ended up choosing, a simple ivory crepe with a low back and small buttons all the way down the spine, Danny said, "That's the one," in this quiet, certain voice. And I believed her. That was February. By April, things started to feel different. It started small. Danny began not returning calls about wedding logistics. I'd text her about bridesmaid dress fittings, and she'd respond 3 days later with some excuse about work being crazy. She stopped attending planning meetings. She cancelled a bridal shower planning session with Marcy twice, and then stopped responding to Marcy altogether, which forced Marcy to do most of the shower planning herself. I noticed all of this, but filed it under the general category of Danny being Danny. She had always had a casual relationship with other people's timelines. I told myself she was going through something with the Trevor breakup. I told myself she'd pull it together closer to the date. In June, my mother called me on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk at work, eating a sad desk lunch, and I saw her name on my phone and felt the familiar low-level anxiety that her calls always produced. I answered. "I just want you to know," my mother said, without preamble, "that I think it would mean a lot if you let Danny do the reading at the ceremony." I had already assigned the reading to my friend Gwen, who had a beautiful voice and who had specifically asked to participate. I told my mother this. Well, I just think Danny should have something more prominent, my mother said. She's your sister. It's her day too, in a way. I sat there for a moment, with my salad fork held in midair. It's not her day, Mom. It's mine and Daniel's day. Well, of course it is. I just meant, I'll think about it, I said, which was my version of no, delivered in the only language my family had ever taught me to speak. I didn't think about it. Gwen kept the reading. In July, something happened that I should have paid more attention to than I did. I was at my parents' house for the 4th of July, and I went to use the bathroom off the back hallway, and I heard my mother and Danny talking in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. I heard my mother say something I couldn't quite catch, and then I heard Danny say, clearly, "She's not going to know what hit her." I stood there in the hallway for a moment. The bathroom door was 3 feet away. I heard my mother laugh. This low, private laugh I barely recognized. I pushed down whatever I was feeling and went into the bathroom. And when I came out, I walked into the kitchen, and both of them were standing there, looking perfectly normal, and I said nothing. Because what was I going to say? I had no context. I had no proof. I had the 6-word sentence and the gut feeling, and I had spent my entire life being told that my gut feelings about this family were an overreaction. So I filed it away and went back to the party. The summer went on. The wedding was getting closer. The venue was a renovated barn outside of Dayton. Exposed wood beams, big arched windows, Edison lights strung across the ceiling. We were having 200 guests. The ceremony was at 4 in the afternoon, the reception immediately after. I had obsessed over every detail with the particular madness of a woman who needed this one day to be entirely, purely hers. The dress was altered and hanging in my closet. The flowers, dusty rose, garden roses, white ranunculus, greenery, were ordered. The photographer was booked. The caterer was confirmed. In September, 6 weeks before the wedding, Marcy called me. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice had that quality that made my stomach drop before she'd said anything else. "What?" "I ran into Julie Harmon at the grocery store." Julie Harmon was a woman we'd both known in high school, someone who still moved in some of the same social circles as my family through the church my parents attended. She mentioned something about Danny. I waited. She said, and I don't know how true this is, I don't know what Danny told her. She said that Danny has been telling people that she's been thinking about making a statement at your wedding. Something about being invisible her whole life. Julie kind of laughed about it like it was a joke, like, "Oh, Danny's always so dramatic." But Claire, it didn't feel like a joke to me. I was quiet for a long time. I was standing in my kitchen, and I set down the glass I was holding very carefully on the counter, and I said, "What kind of statement?" "I don't know. Julie didn't know either, or said she didn't know. But something about wanting everyone to see her. Something about your wedding being a good moment for that." After I hung up with Marcy, I sat on my kitchen floor. Not dramatically. I just slid down against the cabinets and sat there. I thought about the 6 words I'd overheard in July. I thought about every bridesmaid commitment Danny had missed, every planning meeting she'd skipped. I thought about the way Danny had said, "That's the one," in the bridal boutique, with that quiet, certain voice, looking at me in my dress. And something clicked into place that I hadn't let myself see before. She hadn't been uninvested in my wedding. She'd been studying it. She had been watching me plan the most important day of my life, learning every detail of it, and she was going to use those details against me. I started making phone calls the next morning. First, I called the venue. I told them there was a possibility that someone might attempt to enter wearing white, and I asked them to establish a clear protocol with security. The venue manager, a calm woman named Chandra, who had probably dealt with every conceivable wedding disaster in her 10 years managing events, took my concern completely seriously. She said they would have staff positioned specifically to intercept anyone dressed inappropriately before they entered the main space. She said they'd seen this kind of situation before. Not exactly like it, but similar. Family members who couldn't let a wedding be someone else's moment. She did not seem shocked. That, somehow, made me feel both better and worse. Then I called Marcy. I told her what I was thinking and what I'd arranged with the venue. Marcy's response was immediate. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to be my eyes. If Dani shows up in anything white, anything that could be mistaken for a bridal gown, I need to know the second she's spotted." "Done," Marcy said. "I'll coordinate with the venue staff." Then I sat with the hardest question, which was, what do I do about Dani as maid of honor? Do I cancel? Do I say nothing and let the plan unfold? Do I confront her? I thought about it for 2 full days. I thought about confronting her and the way she would deny everything, turn it around, make me the paranoid sister who'd ruined everything with accusations. I thought about canceling her role and the explosion that would follow, the calls from my mother, the family drama that would swamp the weeks before my wedding. I thought about what my father would say, how he would look at me. And then I thought about something else. I thought about what it would feel like, just once, to not be the one managing the situation, to not be the ones moving things over, absorbing the impact, quietly rearranging my own needs so that everyone else could be comfortable. I thought about what it would feel like to just let her do it. Let her walk into that venue thinking she'd won, and then let her find out that she hadn't. I kept Dani as maid of honor and said nothing, and I waited. The last week before the wedding was the most surreal week of my life. I was simultaneously the happiest I'd been in years, because Daniel was wonderful and excited and took the week off work so we could handle last-minute details together. And operating on this parallel level of cold, strategic alertness that felt utterly foreign to me. I'm not a strategic person by nature. I'm direct, I'm organized, I work with facts. What I was doing in those final days felt like a different version of myself. Someone sharper-edged. Someone who had finally stopped being afraid of the sharpness. Dani called me 4 days before the wedding to talk about the ceremony schedule. She was normal on the phone. Completely normal. She asked about the processional order, about the rehearsal dinner timing, about whether she'd have time before the ceremony to get her hair touched up. I answered all of it calmly and told her the plan, and she said, "I can't wait. This is going to be so beautiful, Claire." I said thank you and got off the phone. I called Marcy immediately after. She sounded normal, I said. Of course she did, Marcy said. She's been planning this for months. The rehearsal dinner was the night before. It went smoothly in the way that events go smoothly when everyone is pretending. Danny was charming and gracious and gave a sweet little speech about sisterhood and love that made my mother cry and made me watch Danny's face very carefully while she delivered it. There was something underneath the charm, a brightness that felt slightly off, slightly heightened, like someone who was excited about something they weren't telling you. I caught it only once, for half a second, when she glanced at my mother and the glance held just a fraction too long. Some communication passed between them that ideas of. My father hugged me on the way out. He held on longer than usual, and when he pulled back, his eyes were a little bright. "You're going to be beautiful tomorrow," he said. "I love you." He said it the way people say things when they're trying to make up for something, and I thought, he knows, or suspects, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And for a moment I almost told him, almost sat him down right there in the parking lot of the rehearsal dinner restaurant and said, "Dad, here's what I think is going to happen tomorrow. Here's what I've arranged. I need you to be ready." But I didn't, because I didn't trust him not to go straight to my mother. And if he went to my mother, it would get back to Danny, and the whole thing would unravel. I went home with Daniel, and I didn't sleep much. I lay there in the dark, listening to him breathe, steady and slow, already asleep. And I thought about the dress hanging in my closet, about the venue in the morning light, about the way the October air had turned sharp and clean and perfect for a wedding day. I thought about who I was and who I was going to be after tomorrow. Both possibilities felt real. Both felt terrifying in completely different ways. Wedding morning, October 14th. I was up at 6, showered by 6:30, at the salon by 7:30, with Marcy and my 2 other bridesmaids, women named Petra and Gail, both longtime friends from college. Danny was supposed to be at the salon at 8. She texted at 7:58. "Running a few minutes late. Be there soon." She arrived at 8:22. She was wearing a long coat, a camel-colored wool coat that came to her ankles. In October, that was not unreasonable. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, said, "Oh my God, your hair is going to look amazing," and sat down in the chair they'd set up for her. The coat stayed on while her hair was being done. When the stylist offered to take it, Danny said she was actually a little cold and kept it on. She kept it on through hair. She kept it on through makeup. Marcy caught my eye in the mirror and I gave the smallest nod. We moved to the venue at 11. There was a bridal suite, a comfortable room with a full-length mirror and good lighting, where the bridal party would get into their dresses and do final preparations before the ceremony. Danny was with me, with Marcy, with Petra and Gail, with my mother who had arrived and who was radiating a particular energy I had learned over a lifetime to recognize. The barely contained excitement of someone waiting for something to happen. The bridesmaids' dresses were blush, a deep, warm rose pink. All four of them had theirs on hangers. Marcy put hers on first. Petra and Gail followed. Danny stood in the corner of the room, still in her coat. "Danny," my mother said, with what I can only describe as pointed prompting, "you should probably get into your dress." "In a minute, Mum," Danny said pleasantly. My dress was being helped onto me by Marcy, button by careful button up the back, and I was watching Danny in the mirror, just watching. My face was calm. I had decided, somewhere in those sleepless hours the night before, that I was not going to show anything. Whatever happened, I was going to be calm. I was not going to give her the reaction she was built for. Danny waited until my dress was fully on, until Marcy had done the last button, until I had turned to face the mirror, and then, with everyone watching, she took off the coat. The dress underneath it was white, not ivory, not champagne, not blush, not cream, white. Pure bridal white, with a sweetheart neckline and a full skirt and what appeared to be a small cathedral-length train. It was a wedding dress. There was no other word for what it was. Danny had shown up to my wedding in a wedding dress. The room went completely silent. Danny lifted her chin and looked at me in the mirror with an expression I had never seen on her face before and hoped to never see again. This bright, almost beatific smile, like she had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. "I just thought," she said, her voice perfectly light, perfectly casual, "since this is such a special day for the whole family, I should look special too." Petra made a sound. Gail said, "Oh my God," under her breath. Marcy was completely still. My mother, standing by the window, folded her hands together and looked at Danny with that warm, approving look she had always reserved specifically for her, the one that said, "Good girl, this is exactly right." I held my own gaze in the mirror for one full second. Then I turned around. "Danny," I said, in the calmest voice I have ever produced in my life, "you need to leave." She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "You need to leave the bridal suite, and then you need to leave the venue." "Claire, you're not a bridesmaid anymore. You're not a guest anymore. I've already arranged for the venue staff to escort you out if you don't go on your own." Her expression flickered, just for a second, the tiniest crack in the performance. "You're being absolutely ridiculous. This is a fashion choice. It's not—" "It's a wedding dress," I said. "We're at my wedding. You're wearing a wedding dress. And you're leaving." "Pamela," Danny started, turning to our mother. My mother stepped forward. I watched it happen. I watched her take a step toward me, not toward Danny. And my heart did something complicated in my chest. And then she stopped. And she said, very quietly, "Danny, maybe you should—" "Mom," Danny said, sharp now, the performance slipping. "Mom, you said—" "I know what I said." My mother's voice had gone tight. She wouldn't look at either of us now. She looked at the window. I stored that exchange somewhere deep for later. Right now I had a wedding to get through. I stepped to the door of the bridal suite and opened it. Chandra, the venue manager, was already in the hallway. I had texted her 20 minutes earlier when Danny's coat stayed on through makeup. A single message. She's here, standing by. Chandra looked at me. I nodded. Within 3 minutes, 2 members of the venue staff were at the bridal suite door. Professionally, quietly, with the manner of people who understood the weight of the situation and were not going to make it more dramatic than it needed to be. One of them spoke to Danny in a low voice. Danny's face cycled through approximately 6 different emotions in about 4 seconds. Shock, fury, calculation, and then, finally, something that might have been the dawning of genuine comprehension. "You planned this," she said, looking at me. Her voice had lost its pleasant finish. "Chandra," I said, "thank you." I looked at Danny one last time. "Goodbye, Danny." She was escorted out. She did not go quietly. I could hear her voice in the hallway, rising, and then the sound of the exterior door. My mother was still standing by the window. She didn't follow Danny. She didn't call after her. She stood there with her hands clasped, and she looked at the floor. The bridal suite was very quiet. Petra said softly, "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said, and I turned back to the mirror and looked at myself. My dress, my hair, my face, and I took a breath so deep it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in 6 weeks. "Yes, I'm okay. Let's get married." What happened in the hallway? I didn't see it, but Marcy told me about it later, in pieces, over the weeks after the wedding. When Danny was escorted through the lobby, about 40 guests had already arrived for the ceremony. 40 people who watched a woman in a full white bridal gown, a gown unmistakably more elaborate than any bridesmaid dress, being walked out of the venue by 2 staff members. The murmur that went through that lobby was immediate and significant. Several people took out their phones. Danny's expression, by all accounts, had abandoned performance entirely by that point. She was just furious, red-faced, jaw-tight, telling the staff members to let go of her, that she was the maid of honor, that there had been a misunderstanding. One of the staff members said politely and firmly, "Ma'am, the bride has asked that you leave the property." That sentence, in front of 40 witnesses, cost Danny more than anything I could have said to her in private. My father was one of those 40 people. He saw it happen. He told me later, after the wedding, that he had watched Danny being escorted out and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. He didn't elaborate on what that meant. I didn't ask. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, through the Edison lights and the garden roses, and the murmur of 200 people standing for me. And I looked at Daniel at the end of that aisle. Daniel, who knew none of the Danny situation in real time, who had been sequestered in the groom's suite all morning. And the way he looked at me made everything else very small and very far away. His eyes were wet. He pressed his lips together like he was trying to hold himself together. When my father gave me his hand and I took it, Daniel said quietly, so only I could hear, "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life." And I thought, this is what a whole life of choosing the wrong rooms has been leading to. This room, this man, this. Gwen gave the reading. Her voice was exactly as beautiful as I'd known it would be. The vows were the ones Daniel and I had written ourselves. Specific and honest and occasionally funny. And there was real laughter from the guests at the right moments and real quiet at the others. When we were pronounced married and Daniel kissed me, the room erupted in the way I felt in my sternum. 200 people who had no idea what had happened an hour and a half earlier in the bridal suite, just genuinely celebrating us. At the reception, Marcy gave the maid of honor speech. She had not been officially named maid of honor. I hadn't changed the program in time, but she stood up and gave a speech anyway. And it was the best speech anyone has ever given for anyone at any event in the history of events. She talked about knowing me since the 7th grade. She talked about the particular quality of steadiness I had that most people missed because they were too busy looking for drama. And how watching me plan this wedding and handle every obstacle with quiet, focused grace had reminded her why she loved me. She did not mention Danny by name. She didn't need to. Every person in that room who knew my family understood exactly what she was talking about. I cried through the last 2 minutes of it. Daniel cried too, which embarrassed him enormously and which I found deeply endearing. My mother sat at the family table. She ate dinner. She danced one dance with my father. She smiled when people spoke to her. She looked, for most of the night, like someone who was holding very still so she didn't break. At some point in the evening, I went to her. I don't know entirely why. Old habits. She was sitting alone at the table with a glass of white wine, and I sat down in the chair next to her and didn't say anything for a moment. She went too far, my mother said finally. She wasn't looking at me. I know you think I knew what she was planning. I waited. I knew she was going to do something. Her voice was very quiet. I didn't know she'd bought a dress. I thought she might wear white, a white blouse or something. I didn't know it was a gown. Did you try to stop her? A long pause. No. She drank from her wine glass. I don't know what I thought. You thought it would be funny, I said, not angrily, just naming it. She didn't deny it. That was, in its own terrible way, the most honest thing my mother had ever given me. I stood up. I looked at her for a moment. This woman who had managed to be physically present at every major event of my life and emotionally absent at all of them. And I said, enjoy the rest of the night. And I went back to my husband and I danced until midnight. The weeks after the wedding were a cascade of consequences that I had not entirely planned for, but which I watched unfold with the kind of detached clarity that sometimes follows long-awaited events. Danny did not take the escort quietly, and because 40 people had watched it happen, and approximately 12 of them had captured some portion of it on their phones, it was a conversation piece at the reception and beyond. Within a week, the story was circulating in the extended family and social networks that both our families moved in. The version of events Danny told, which was that I had overreacted to a fashion choice, that the dress wasn't that white, that she had always planned to change into something else before the ceremony, was not a version that many people found credible, given that a full cathedral-length train is not the kind of thing that leaves room for ambiguity. Danny's social life, which had always been the central thing she organized herself around, took a significant hit. Friends who had always found her charming started asking questions she didn't have good answers to. Trevor, her ex-boyfriend, resurfaced in this period in an interesting way. He reached out to a mutual acquaintance to say that he'd heard what happened, and that it didn't surprise him, that one of the reasons he'd ended things with Danny was a specific incident at his brother's engagement party, where Danny had drawn attention to herself in a way that had upset his family. He didn't go into detail publicly, but the story added to a picture that people were starting to put together. My mother called me 3 weeks after the wedding. It was a Sunday morning, and I almost didn't answer, and then I did. "I want to talk to you," she said. "Okay." A long exhale. "I want to talk to you about the way things have been between us for a long time." I sat down. I set my coffee mug on the table and looked at the wall and waited. "I know I haven't been fair to you," she said. The words came out like they cost her something. "I know I favored Danny. I've known it for a long time, and I convinced myself it wasn't that significant, or that you didn't notice. And I know that was wrong. I know it was wrong." I listened to her breathe. The silence between us had the particular weight of 31 years of things unsaid. "Is that an apology?" I asked. "I'm trying to make it one, yes." "Okay," I said. "I hear you." "I don't expect Mom, I hear you. I'm not ready to talk about what that means yet, but I hear you." She said okay. We hung up. I sat at the table for a while with my cold coffee and felt the strange sensation of something that had been locked for a very long time, being turned with a key I hadn't expected. I don't know what my mother and Danny's relationship is now. I know it changed after the wedding. Danny blamed my mother for not intervening more forcefully, for not standing up for her in the bridal suite. My mother, for reasons that are probably complicated and that I may never fully understand, chose not to. The warmth that had always flowed so naturally between them turned, at least for a while, rocky and difficult. Whether it healed back to what it was, I can't say. It's not my business anymore. Danny and I have not spoken since the wedding. She sent a text message 3 days afterward that said simply, "I can't believe you did this to me." I read it once and did not respond. She sent one more a month later, longer, laying out her version of events in detail, explaining that she had meant the dress as a tribute to the family tradition of looking beautiful at important occasions, that I had taken it entirely the wrong way, that I had humiliated her in front of people who mattered to her, and she hoped I was satisfied. I read that one twice, and then put my phone down and went for a run. When I came back, I showered and made dinner and didn't answer it. I have not answered it. My father came to dinner at our house about a month after the wedding. Just him, not my mother, which was a first. He sat at our table and ate the pot roast I'd made and talked to Daniel about football and about work and about the projects Daniel's firm was doing. And then at some point in the evening, while Daniel was in the kitchen doing dishes, and my father and I were sitting at the table with our wine, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't do more." when you were growing up. Dad, let me say it. He looked at his glass. I saw it, the way things were. And I told myself it wasn't as bad as you might think it was, or that you were handling it okay, or that it wasn't my place to... He stopped. None of that was true. It was as bad as you thought it was, and it was absolutely my place. And I'm sorry I didn't step up. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. His hand was big and dry and worn. My father's hand. The hand that had coached my softball team and left extra 20s in my jacket pocket and squeezed my shoulder at moments when words were too complicated. I know, I said. I know you saw it. And I know you tried, in your way. My way wasn't enough. No, I said honestly, it wasn't. But I love you anyway. He looked at me for a moment, and then his face crumpled, very briefly, in the way of men who rarely permit themselves to crumple. He covered it quickly. He patted my hand and picked up his wine and said, "Well, that pot roast was excellent." I know, I said. Now it has been 7 months since the wedding. I am 31 years old, and I live in a house that I own with my husband, who looks at me like I am the most interesting person in the room. We have a spare bedroom that we are thinking about what to do with. I have a job I'm good at, and friends who know me, and a father who is trying, in his late 60s way, to make up for lost time. I call him more now. We meet for lunch sometimes. It's awkward occasionally, and then it's not. My mother and I talk, carefully, on the phone. Not often, not easily, but we talk. There are things between us that may never be resolved, not in any clean or satisfying way. 31 years of a specific kind of absence doesn't dissolve because one woman made one difficult phone call on a Sunday morning. But I've stopped expecting it to dissolve. I've stopped waiting for the version of my mother who was fully, unconditionally present, the way I needed her to be. I've accepted the version who is. It's not enough some days. Most days, it's something. Marcy is still my best friend. She was promoted at work recently and called me from her car to tell me, and we screamed at each other for approximately 45 seconds, which is the appropriate response to good news from people you love. I was her emergency contact for the minor surgery she had in March, which meant something to both of us, even though the surgery went fine and required no actual emergency contacting. The oval diamond ring is on my finger. The wedding photos are on our wall. Marcy chose the one for the living room, a candid shot of me and Daniel at the reception, my head thrown back, laughing at something he said, his hand at my waist, both of us lit gold by the Edison lights. It's not a posed photo, it's just a true one. Two people who chose each other, mid-laugh, in a room full of people who loved them. Dani chose to make my wedding about herself. She spent months planning it, coordinating with my mother, buying a dress, constructing a moment that would shift the narrative of that day from me to her. And what she got instead was 40 witnesses in a lobby and a staff escort and a story that followed her into rooms she didn't expect. She aimed to take the spotlight. She got a different kind of attention entirely. I used to think that winning meant getting my mother to love me the way she loved Danny. That was the wrong game. The right game, the one that actually mattered, was becoming someone who didn't need that particular kind of love to feel whole. I'm not entirely there. I'm not sure anyone ever entirely gets there, but I'm closer than I've ever been. There is a photograph I have from the wedding that I haven't put on the wall, that I keep in a drawer in my nightstand. It's from just before the ceremony, taken by Marcy in the bridal suite, after everything with Danny was resolved, and it was just the three of us, me, Marcy, and Gail and Petra. And I am standing in front of the mirror in my dress, and I am looking at myself, and whatever expression is on my face in that photo is not the expression of someone who has been rescued or vindicated or released. It's the expression of someone who just finally, clearly, with no more room for doubt, understands exactly who she is. I look at that photo sometimes, and every time I do, I think, she went too far, and she handed me exactly what I needed. Not justice, not victory, just the truth, sharp and clean, with nowhere left to hide. That was enough. That was, finally, more than enough.